Oh hey, I didn't see you there. I spend a lot of time every day shaving my face, and it's time that I could be spent doing other things. So I've decided to take my skills and develop an all-in-one razor. Check this out. It's all-in-one, and it's perfectly safe. All I gotta do is apply it to my face, and you'll see.
I should probably ask Hyperkin for some advice. The Retron 5 was released in 2014 with the promise of being able to play 9 different platforms: the NES, the Famicom, the Super Nintendo, the Super Famicom, the Genesis, the Mega Drive, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance. Quite the impressive lineup for Hyperkin, considering the fact that most of their Retron consoles can only play 1 or 2 systems. This one can take on much more. Although, maybe not in the way that you expect, because all of the original consoles that played these games back in the day had dedicated chipsets that were developed specifically for the consoles to play the games that the manufacturers intended. Now say that you're a hardware developer and you want to develop an NES clone that can play consoles relatively faithfully to the original hardware. You have 2 choices. Choice A is the one that's been used for years. You can develop hardware that's similar to the NES that mimics it to the best of its abilities, although with some slight caveats. A lot of times these aftermarket consoles, which have been dubbed by the community as Famiclones, suffer from a plague of issues such as improper sound output and video scaling. The other option you have, if you don't want to mimic the original hardware itself, is to mimic the original hardware through software emulation. Tons of non-commercial emulators have existed for years that emulate consoles near perfectly on the computer. A good amount of these are also open source, hence why you sometimes see these emulators available on devices like Android phones. And emulation appears to be the exact avenue that Hyperkin decided to go with for the Retron 5 in order to make it run this many consoles. And unfortunately, it appears that Hyperkin decided to steal the source code from a couple of the more famous emulators to use on their Retron 5. While Hyperkin has argued that they aren't technically doing anything illegal here because these emulators are all open source anyways, a lot of these emulators were developed specifically for personal use and say absolutely nowhere that it's okay to use it for commercial uses. Needless to say, this argument is still ongoing.
Now, despite how this video's tone has gone so far, I want to make it abundantly clear that I'm not anti-emulation. I think emulation is incredibly important for our hobby. One, it preserves it for future generations, and also it makes it much easier to obtain the access to the libraries of games that we have. So I think emulation is overall a wonderful thing, but I also agree that it's important to give credit where it's due, and a lot of people seem to agree that, yeah, maybe Hyperkin haven't done that. So let's put that aside, and let's get to the unboxing.
When you first crack open the box, you'll be greeted with a console, an AC adapter, some paperwork, stickers, a controller, an HDMI cable, and a micro to mini USB cable for charging the controller. Now, the process of pairing the controller to the console was a bit of a pain in the ass. It didn't want to pair for the longest time, and then eventually, after about 30 failed attempts, it just suddenly started working. So let's peel this cling film off and get to the meat and potatoes. Might as well start with the console itself. You may notice 5 slots at the top. One for the Genesis, one for the NES, one for the Super NES, and one for the Famicom, and of course the one for the controller. There is also a slot in the front for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. There are 6 controller ports, 3 on either side, 2 NES, 2 Genesis, and 2 Super Nintendo. If we rotate the console, you'll notice out back there's an HDMI port, an AC adapter port, a mini USB port for charging the controller, and an SD card port. You may notice there is absolutely no AV out on this console. To this day, this still absolutely perplexes me. Why wouldn't Hyperkin put an AV output on their multi-console? I would understand if this was a cheap Famiclone that was just marketed to the casual crowd to make a quick buck off of people with their modern TVs, but this was marketed towards the hardcore audience and carries a hefty price tag. I don't understand why Hyperkin would take a feature like an AV output away from us, especially considering the amount of people in the hardcore retro gaming hobby that are buying old televisions specifically for reliving these old consoles the way they were meant to be played. At least they gave us a couple different retro controller options to make the console feel a little bit more genuine to the original hardware. But while we're on the topic of controllers, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the one that's included with the Retron 5. Now, I've been in this hobby for a pretty long time, and over the last 10 to 15 years that I've been actively collecting video games, I've managed to feel almost every single first-party commercially available controller from the 80s and 90s. I say the majority of because there's obviously some incredibly rare ones like the Philips CDI Spoon controller and a Sega Saturn pad, which I still don't know anyone that owns a Sega Saturn, but I'm going to make an executive decision here. I'm going to make a call. I'm going to make a statement that may be controversial and might get me in trouble. The Retron 5 controller, without a shadow of a doubt, is the worst controller that I have ever used in my entire life. I don't even know where to begin. The micro switch joystick was a great idea in concept, but I feel like its execution was pretty poor. It plays fine for fighting games, I suppose, but literally any other genre I've thrown at this thing, it's too imprecise and has way too much travel. It's uncomfortable for platformers, it's impossible to play puzzle games with this thing. It's useless. And then we move over to the buttons. Instead of putting, the fucking alphabet on them, they opted for this weird symbolic arrows and plus and minus option. It doesn't look good. I know they were probably trying to go with a PlayStation sort of thing, but there's no games on this console that use two different directional pad layouts. What were they, expecting this thing to play fucking Virtual Boy games? The top two buttons are equally as useless. The left one requires way too much heft to press down, and the right one goes in a little too easy and it gets stuck. The only positive thing I can say about this controller is that the select, start, and home buttons feel alright. But when the only compliment I can give you is your fucking home button is okay, I think you messed up the controller design, Hyperkin. Now I know what you're thinking. Danny, yeah, that controller does look ugly and uncomfortable, but how is it the worst controller you've ever used? Input lag. I'm gonna play a clip of me pressing the jump button in Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Now I'm gonna play that clip a second time, but before I do, close your eyes. I'm not gonna put anything on the screen. I want you to focus on the audio itself. Listen to how long the delay is between me pressing the button and Sonic jumping. Yeah, draw your own conclusions. I know this is going to get brought up. No, it's not my TV. I play Switch and PS4 games on this thing all the time and I never have an issue. And on top of that, thanks to the most recent patch, Hyperkin added the ability for you to connect 8-bit Do controllers wirelessly to this console, which cut down on the input lag exponentially. So if you want to play your Retron 5 with a wireless controller, please buy an 8-bit Do one. Do not use the one that's included.
I still have no idea what they were thinking with this controller, but let's put that aside and let's get to the actual emulators themselves. That's the meat and potatoes of this video after all. Now I'm going to be grading them on like a school grading card rubric. I'll put an image up of the rubric I'm going to be using. Now it's important to note that I'm only going to be judging these emulators off of gameplay and compatibility. Do the games run? And if they do run, how well do they run? I'm not going to be judging based off of any artifacts you may hear or see, because while those could be the emulators, it could also be things like my cartridges not making proper connections with the Retron 5.
The first game I tried was the classic Super Mario Bros. It booted up perfectly fine and played as normal. The next game I wanted to try was Super Mario Bros. 3. Once again, booted up perfectly fine, played perfectly normal. Next I tried Mega Man 2, really trying to cover all of the classics here. Mega Man 2, once again, booted up perfectly fine and played great. Next up I tried Blaster Master. Now this is going to be a great example for testing out the emulation features, such as the save states. With only a short button command, trip to the menu, or single button press of the terrible included controller, you can save and load states at will. This is a feature on pretty much every emulator, and I'm happy to see it included with the Retron 5. And Blaster Master works great. Next up I tried Kirby's Adventure. It's a battery backup game, so I wanted to see how well a certain feature of the Retron 5 works. You see, the Retron 5 is touted as being able to dump your old saves and have them stored forever. I'm happy to report this feature worked great, and Kirby's Adventure, once again, played flawlessly. Let's make things interesting. Throw a couple curveballs in here, starting off with an unlicensed game, in this case, Pac-Man by Tengen. Although the metadata wasn't able to be pulled from the cartridge and there were some visual artifacts, the game itself played perfectly fine. Finally, the last thing we tried out was the Game Genie. Now, I didn't expect the Game Genie to actually work, but I expected the ROM to be ripped from it at the very least, but unfortunately, no, that didn't end up happening. I would just be met with a black screen every single time that I booted it on, which was unfortunate. So NES compatibility is not at 100% for my list, but I'm still gonna give it a solid B+. Next up, we're gonna try Mega Drive / Genesis emulation, and I'm sort of bundling this together because I don't have any Mega Drive games, but I do have some Genesis games, and it wouldn't be a Genesis video without Arnold Palmer's Tournament Golf, so let's pop that in, and yeah, the game itself plays perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next I tried Miss Pac-Man. We did her husband, might as well do her as well. Ironically enough, just like her husband, her metadata couldn't be ripped from the cartridge, but the game itself did play perfectly fine, this time with no artifacting whatsoever. So Miss Pac-Man definitely gets a pass. Next I tried both Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, as well as being an absolute madman and combined them both together for Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and to my absolute delight, every single configuration worked perfectly fine. The fact that this is able to work but not the NES Game Genie puts kind of a sour taste in my mouth, but I'm very happy that it works regardless. And finally, the last Genesis game I tried was the recently released Retrobit published Mega Man The Wily Wars, for the first time ever getting a limited release in North America. Once again, the metadata could not be read from this cartridge, however, the game itself played perfectly fine, and yes, I did wear the hell out of the save state option. This is a very, very difficult version of Mega Man 1, 2, and 3. Still very playable, with no glitches whatsoever. The Retron passed the Genesis test with flying colors and obtains an A+. Moving on to Famicom emulation is where things get a little interesting, because the only quote-unquote Famicom game I have is this PowerJoy bootleg cartridge that came with a knockoff Famiclone about 20 years ago. So 100% of the compatibility test is resting on this bootleg cartridge. Now I know what you're thinking, Danny, that is totally unfair. Why would you do this? And trust me, I agree with you, but get this, when I popped it into the Retron, the menus, yeah, they were a little corrupted. To be fair, that could just be because I didn't blow in the cartridge before putting it in, but I was able to find my way through the menu and load up every single game. I even found a bootleg version of Spy vs. Spy, which is an excellent NES game. I didn't even know that was on here, so I'm giving this 100%. If it can play this bootleg crap, I'm sure it can play whatever Famicom games you have laying around. Yeah, I know the menus were a little corrupted, and trying to find what game is what is an absolute bitch on this thing, but fuck you, I'm playing Pandamar on my Retron 5. I'm giving this thing an A+. Next was 3D Golf Simulation New, I think that's how this title is pronounced. Unfortunately, I don't really know much about this title because I don't speak fluent Japanese yet, I'm still learning. But like the last entry, this is the only Super Famicom game I own, so I'm delighted to tell you, it works perfectly fine. And as a result, Super Famicom gets another 100% and an A+. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules, I just don't have too many Super Famicom games. Let's take a break from the home consoles and head to the handhelds, starting with Metroid 2, which booted up great and plays absolutely fine. Next I tried Donkey Kong 94, and to my surprise, the Super Game Boy border is here. The Retron 5 can accurately emulate the Super Game Boy, that's awesome. Donkey Kong 94 runs fine, and because the border is here, that also means that my next game, Pokemon Red's also going to look a little bit more exciting. The border looks great, and the game plays absolutely fine. Next I tried Donkey Kong Land 2, which I didn't even know had a Super Game Boy border. This looks awesome. The game itself also plays fine. Next up, I decided to give Wario Land a go. Unfortunately, no border for this one, but the game itself still plays absolutely fine. I forgot how much fun Wario Land was. I'd recommend this one. Finally, I decided to see if the Retron 5 could handle the Game Boy camera, so I popped it in and nothing. The lights on the Retron remained solid, which indicates that there was either a connection error or some sort of software error. Just to be on the safe side, I decided to try my other Game Boy camera, and yep, still absolutely nothing. I thought I was going crazy. I thought maybe the Game Boy camera's all broke, so busted out the old GameCube and the GBA player, and yeah, no, this still works absolutely fine. As a matter of fact, it booted up on the very first attempt on the GameCube. I'm not sure what the Retron 5's vendetta is against the Game Boy camera. Unfortunately, that is going to take points away from the Game Boy's final score, but I do like the Super Game Boy borders, which kind of makes up for some of the shortcomings. I'll give the Game Boy an A-. While we're on the topic of Game Boy, let's try Game Boy Color, and the first game I had to try was Pokemon Crystal. It booted right up just like Red, and it played absolutely perfectly. No complaints here. Next I tried Asteroids, which had a Super Game Boy specific mode, but was also a Game Boy Color game. It played perfectly fine, no complaints. While we're on the topic of arcade ports having specific Super Game Boy modes, I also tried out Space Invaders. Unfortunately, the Retron 5 could not load the Super Nintendo port of Space Invaders that was hidden on the Game Boy cart. Now that sucks, because I know a lot of collectors that specifically search out this cartridge in particular specifically for this reason, so to see it not work is a bit heartbreaking. The normal game mode did work fine, however, and you know I'm a sucker for the Super Game Boy border. Next up I tried Frogger, which was a really late Game Boy Color game. It plays fine. Nothing really to complain about here. That bootleg version got me in the mood for more Spy vs. Spy, so I popped in the Game Boy Color version, and it played perfectly fine. This is a really fun game. I recommend you guys try this one out with a friend. The final challenge, because I love my curveballs, was to see if the Game Boy Color emulator was up to emulating the limited run games version of Shantae. For a lot of people, this is the only way that they're going to be able to play the original Shantae on an actual Game Boy cartridge. So does it work? Well, the answer is kind of. The game itself does function perfectly fine, but the emulator doesn't detect the Game Boy Advance hardware that is on the actual cartridge itself. You see, the original Shantae had an updated GBA mode that happened when you plugged it into a Game Boy Advance. It was that late of a Game Boy Color game, and that added a bunch of extra features that are unfortunately unobtainable on the Retron 5 unless you download a patch. You see, one of the other emulator functions the Retron 5 can do is apply patches of ROMs over other ROMs. So if you want to download a ROM of the original Shantae and patch it over this release, well, you can do that and you'll get the Game Boy Advance functionality back, but it doesn't really feel like you're playing this cartridge anymore. Still, it does work. You can completely play the original version of Shantae without the GBA enhanced features on the Retron 5. Technically, this should get an A+, because the two features that I tried to play were for other consoles that just so happened to be on Game Boy Color cartridges. So I'm going to award it an A+ out of principle, but if you want to judge it a little bit more harshly and be a bit more critical than I am, go for it. Let's move on to Game Boy Advance now. Super Mario Advance 4 is always my game of choice because I love Mario 3 and it plays perfectly fine with no complaints. Next up, Namco Museum, because why not? It runs fine, plays everything perfectly fine, yeah, no complaints whatsoever. I wanted to give Sonic Genesis a go to see if emulation fixes any of its problems. No, but it does run about as well as it does on real hardware, so yeah. Next up, Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure, why not? Despite the fact that I royally suck at Crash Bandicoot games, this one runs perfectly fine, no complaints. Next, I tried Mario Kart Super Circuit. Jesus Christ, don't play this on a big TV. I feel so motion sick only after a few minutes. I never played this one back in the day, and I'm kind of glad. It runs fine on the Retron, and if you excuse me, I'm gonna go chug a bottle of Pepto-Bismol. Might as well try out Mario Golf while we're at it. The last Game Boy Advance game I'm going to try isn't a game at all. It's a GBA video card of SpongeBob. It works fine, and I can't show you more than the menus, otherwise Nintendo and Nickelodeon are both going to double team me in the prison showers, if you know what I mean. The Super Nintendo is the final category we're going to finish off on, and a lot of people buy these consoles specifically for their SNES emulation, so let's hope that it's accurate. Super Mario World plays okay. There's a huge caveat though. Input lag strikes back, although this time it's not a hardware issue, it's the emulator itself. You could probably adjust to it. It's not as bad as the wireless controller was with, well, literally every other emulator, but it's still absolutely obnoxious. Then I tried Mario All-Stars, and again, the input lag is a little annoying, but it's manageable. Mario All-Stars gets a pass. Next up, let's try Star Fox. Star Fox is a great example of a game that you should always test emulators with because of its Super FX chip. Not everything is compatible with it, but unfortunately Star Fox is such a slow and clunky game naturally that the input lag makes it nearly unplayable. Next up, Donkey Kong Country. The game plays okay, minus the input lag. The minecart level with input lag is a fucking nightmare. Next up, Street Fighter. Originally I was going to test the controller with this, but I didn't want to double the amount of input lag, so I just used the SNES pad. It's fine, it plays fine. And the final thing we're going to test is the Super Game Boy. I popped it in, and it works. It doesn't actually read the ROM of the Game Boy games because how the fuck would that work? But it does read the actual ROM itself, which is what I was trying to get the Game Boy camera and Game Genie to do. The fact that I could get it to work on the Super Game Boy proves that the emulators are a little bit inconsistent on this. I know that the visuals aren't the most exciting thing in the world right now, but if you need a high quality border of the Super Game Boy, feel free to screenshot. Despite the fact that every Super Nintendo game I tried technically did work, I'm still gonna have to give it a C just because of the amount of input lag that they all suffered from because of the emulator. So in conclusion, what the hell happened here? This is the 5th iteration of the Retron consoles, right? Not some random experiment Hyperkin released a couple years ago for dirt cheap, right? Speaking of dirt cheap, this console definitely isn't. The price is something that I've avoided talking about throughout this video because I wanted to wait until the very end to drop this bombshell on you. You may have already tabbed out and looked this up, but if you haven't, you're in for a surprise. The Retron 5 currently retails for $179.99. Needless to say, no, I don't think that's worth it. Now, I didn't pay anywhere near that. I think I paid $140 on an Amazon Prime sale, but that's still a little too much for what you're getting. You're getting an emulator box with a useless built-in controller, a terrible Super Nintendo emulator, and a pretty good NES, Game Boy, and Genesis emulator. All of this for $179.99, or you can spend $20 more and get a Nintendo Switch Lite, Or you can spend $100 more than that and get an Xbox Series S, a next-generation console. What the hell was Hyperkin thinking with this pricing? They obviously must see diminishing returns on this, because $180 for any emulator box that doesn't output games as well as they should is a little bit of a ripoff. There are many alternatives that I think are genuinely better products, like the Polymega and Retro Freak, and for $100 less than the Retron 5, you can buy the Super Retro Trio Plus, which is basically the exact same console, but without the built-in Gameboy port. I will still recommend the Retron 5 for one reason and one reason only: content creation. As a YouTuber who records a lot of video game footage, the Retron 5 is incredibly useful because I can sit on my couch and play any of these classic games with their own original controllers. I don't need to be hunched over at my desk playing Game Boy games with an Xbox 360 controller. I can relax on my couch and play the games as they were intended, and that is nice. But I'm still torn overall, and that's why the title of this video is the best worst console ever, because it really is. There's a lot of crap like the controller and Super Nintendo emulator that absolutely pissed me off to no end, but the excellent NES, Genesis, and Game Boy line emulators make this product pretty useful. So if you're a content creator and you can get this console for cheap, and by cheap I mean like $50 or under, I definitely wouldn't pay anything more than that, you'll probably get your money's worth out of it and enjoy it quite a bit. If anything, being able to play your original cartridges in HD is an awesome thing. It just sucks that you can't play them on a CRT, and the Super Nintendo emulator is also kind of ass.
But enough about that. I finally have a new prototype for my all-in-one razor. Let's try it out. Here goes nothing.